We turn now to the latest job figures for Canada, and the January figures were not good. Recent COVID-19 shutdowns, especially in Quebec and Ontario, cost the economy almost 213,000 jobs. That's the largest single month decline since April, during the height of the pandemic and the first wave. The job losses were almost 4 times more than predicted by economists. The unemployment rate has increased by 0.6% to 9.4%, and the hardest hit sectors remain retail and travel and the hospitality industries. All this is happening while the country is wrestling with the possibility of reopening, but also with the specter of newer, more infectious variants of the coronavirus. So to discuss it all, I'm joined now by Michael Scooterud. He's a specialist in labor economics with the Economics Department at the University of Waterloo. Mr. Scooterud, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
When we look at these figures, first and foremost, to you, a specialist in labor economics, any surprises and what stands out for you?
I tend not to try to guess what the numbers are going to be in advance because I don't like being wrong. So I'm not really surprised. These data captured the week in the middle of January. We know at that time Quebec and Ontario had gone into pretty hard public health measures, lockdowns, if you want to call them. And so I'm not really surprised that we see job losses that aren't nearly as big as we saw in the initial shutdowns back in April and March, but they're big job losses, big sharp job losses that outside of a pandemic are big.
Okay, I've alluded to some of the sectors. What strikes you about who is still, who was affected by this shutdown? Because people are saying it wasn't a complete shutdown, but who was affected and who remains and is still being hurt?
So as you said, it is those sectors that you would expect. It's retail, it's hotels, it's bars, restaurants, it's tourism. It's a lot of part-time workers, a lot of low-wage workers, hourly paid workers, and younger workers. And that's not really that different from what we saw in March, April. It's sort of Groundhog Day. I mean, we're sort of going through the same thing we did before. Not as big of an effect, but we're seeing the same kind of change in the labor market that we saw in March and April.
Is there a sector which has been largely and is still suffering and hasn't really reopened at all? Because some people suggest things like, obviously the cruise industry and some parts of the travel industry, they just have been basically out of luck for the entire duration so far.
So it depends, I guess, on how you define sectors. If you define these sectors narrowly enough, there will be sectors, like you said, that haven't rebounded at all,
okay,
that never fully opened again. And certainly airlines have been hit very, very hard and have not, at least in Canada, bounced back, are just way, way behind what they were. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that matters as much as eventually we are going to see these numbers go up. There's no question. A lot of these losses will be recovered. The question is whether we get back to where we were or where we would have been if the pandemic had never happened.
Okay, what are the biggest concerns for you? Because obviously we have this dynamic where we shut some things down, and quite understandably we see job losses. And as you're suggesting, as we reopen, albeit cautiously, albeit partially, we see jobs coming back. But what are the concerns for you?
So the big concern for me is long-term joblessness among people. We know that the longer you're unemployed for, the harder it is to get back into the labor market. We've seen a lot of people transitioning to what we call out of the labor force. They leave the labor force, which means they're not searching for jobs anymore. Those are the kinds of changes that worry me because they can lead to longer-term effects. We call these kind of ideas hysteresis in economics. It's a term borrowed from physics, but the idea is that if you kind of hit an economy with a shock, it doesn't just bounce back to where it was before. It leaves some kind of permanent change in the economy. And that's because of a number of factors, but we know recessions, economic crises do that, and that's what worries me.
People talk about the active population, that there's a certain unemployment rate, but as things like this continue, a lower and lower percentage of people even think of trying to go out and look for a job. That may be what you're talking about in terms of permanent unemployment.
That's precisely it. So some of it looks kind of voluntary. Older workers, for example, we know when recessions hit, we lose a segment of those older workers. They just say, I'm done with my career. I'm going to go into retirement earlier than I would have otherwise. But there's other groups in the population that you worry about. Younger workers that are, prime age workers that that find other ways to survive, whether that's changing your living arrangements, who you live with, whether that's finding other sources of income that aren't kind of in a traditional paid labor market. These are the kinds of effects that have implications for economic growth, that have very important long-term effects. Keeping workers engaged in the economy is something that labor economists think a lot about, and it's really important.
What about, the most obvious one, obviously, is women. Women who are overrepresented in all of these categories, in the retail, in the hospitality industries, in the cultural industries.
That's absolutely true. And mothers in particular, and mothers with small children. So those are, the reality is that in Canada still today, what women take on that responsibility much more than men. We see that in who takes maternity and parental leaves. There's no question that when these kinds of crises happen, we lose a segment of the labor force because that decision changes about whether or not to work and or stay home with a child.
Last question, and briefly, and I don't know if there's a simple answer to it, but as we are seeing a reopening, a careful, cautious reopening, we're also seeing a vigilance about the possibility that we may have to slam the doors shut again with new variants and a possible third or fourth wave. What do you make of that? Is there any way to reopen safely, and does it inevitably just mean job losses again?
That's the million-dollar question. You just nailed it. And what I'm telling people is that I'm an economist, and the reality is that while this has become an economic crisis, it's a health crisis. And the number one policy prescription here should be health policy and not economic policy. The economy is only following what's happening in the health crisis. If people are sick or people are scared of a virus, people aren't going to work and can't work. And so keep containing those numbers is all this is really about. This is not about economic policies. This is about containing a virus. And I would say that the policies, at least in Ontario, where I live, through the fall, were not strategic enough. I think we really need to focus on what the priorities are. I think schools are priorities. I think small businesses, to some extent, are priorities. I don't think indoor sports and gyms and bars are priorities. And I think that's something we need to think very carefully about going forwards now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We will keep in touch as this evolves. It's not over for sure. Thanks a lot, Mr. Scooterud.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed that.